Hi, this is Paul with a tutorial on OctaneRender for Modo and Motion Blur. So there's a number of different topics to discuss here. There is object motion blur, vertex motion blur, and camera motion blur. I'll cover camera motion blur last, and I'll cover object motion blur first, and vertex motion blur sort of fits within the object motion blur. So you can see here I've got a red octane material on a cube, and there's a transform attached from the cube to the scene, and I've got a translate X there between frames 1 to 10. So you can see as I move the timeline, that cube is moving across the scene. So you can see at this point there is no motion blur. Even if we go and turn motion blur on, so under animation, if we set the shutter time to 100% of the FPS, or even make it say 200%, where we should get a lot of motion blur, you'll see there's still no motion blur there, and that's because the animated transform is not being delivered to Octane, because Octane cannot query that transform across the entire timeline. So how do we get motion blur with that particular cube? What we do is we export the cube to an ABC file, or an Alembic file, which would be contained in an OCS file. So we will add a writer node, and under the write choose OCS, and I'll choose proxy the file to be from nuke1.ocs, and then when we render that, we'll go from 1 to 10. So that's now output that. If we go into Octane standalone, let me just activate. Now you see here the scene that was loaded contains a larger node network than what we actually need from this. Right, so you can see that cube now has motion blur on it. So all we need is this Alembic file here, and we can get the motion blur from that. So if we add an output, a geometry output, and connect the cube to it, and then save it, and then we'll close that, we can go back to Nuke, and if we disconnect, I'll leave the scene in there, if we disconnect that and add a reference scene geometry node and connect that to Octane, and then load the file that was exported and start rendering, you'll see we now have motion blur. So that works pretty well. So the way that is working is that under this reference geometry here, we can edit the scene graph. You can see the scene graph is actually a bit unwieldy, but all it is taking, the only relevant bits that the plugin needs, is this ABC file here, the geometry out, and the material. The rest of it can actually be deleted. So it's just the material, the ABC file, and the geometry out. So that ABC file actually contains the animated vertices. So you can see it runs very nicely. Another thing we can do is we can actually still edit that material, and you can see it edits live in the viewport here. So that's the way you can get motion blur on a Nuke geometry item. Let me just disconnect that now. So you can also get you can do that if you have exported assets to OCS or Orbx from other plugins. For example, I've got a sphere and a cube here. Then it's exactly the same situation. So if we start, so you see I've got a cube and a sphere, and that is static. So if I animate the transform, so at frame 1, and then at frame 10, so you can see as we go across that sphere and cube is animating from the right to the left. Again, we can write to that. I'll go to Nuke 2. And then again, we can put that into the, I'll disconnect that and put it into this one. Connect that to the OctaneRender node. And you can see again that reference geometry is reading the animated vertices from the OCS file instead of from this combination here. So that works really pretty neatly. If you can also merge multiple reference geometries. So I've got the ball and the sphere, and I've got a fire, a VDB file, which is a bit of fire. So again, you can see the fire the fire object is static, so it's not moving, but the sphere and the cube is moving and has motion blur there. And again, you can affect or you can adjust the amount of motion blur by editing the Octane scene. And this shutter time here, so if you choose say 50%, you can see it's quite crisp, or if you choose 500%, it'll be quite blurred. You can also set the shutter alignment, probably symmetric is probably a little better in this case. So that's how you can get motion blur from objects. There's also another scenario where you want to get motion blur from a camera. So in this particular situation, let's put the sphere and the cube directly into OctaneRender. So this will be static. So it's not moving at all, as you can see there. So if we want to animate the camera, I've actually pre-animated a camera here. So you can see as we go across the maybe I haven't pre-animated the camera. No, I haven't. So I'll go to frame 1 and then frame 10. So you can see this camera is now animated, moving across the screen, and you'll see there's no motion blur there. So again, to get motion blur from a camera, we need to export that camera track as an Alembic file. So when I do that, I'm actually going to disconnect, well, I don't have to, but I will disconnect the geometry so that the Alembic file is as small as possible. So now we've just got the camera, the Octane node, and we'll write to from nuke3.ocs. So now when I open that up in Octane standalone, you'll see the relevant bits. Don't worry about the stuff that's not connected. The stuff that's not connected is from these things here, which are not connected. So this ABC file, an ABC file will contain a camera track if there's an animated camera, and a geometry animation if there's animated geometry. So in this particular case, because there was no geometry connected to the OctaneRender node, just the camera animation, this ABC file just contains the camera track, and you can actually see in it. If you click down, create camera pins. Oh, actually, that doesn't show the animation there. Anyway, so I can take this and copy it and go back to Nuke. So if I disconnect that camera and reconnect my geometry, start rendering. So at this point, there's no camera connected, so there'll be there's no animation you can see there. But in the clipboard, I've got that ABC file. So if I go into edit the Octane scene and paste that camera, and then if I connect the camera to the camera pin, you'll see that we have that camera track now feed. Now, okay, that motion blur is a bit extreme. Change the motion blur to, say, 100%. So you'll see that now we have camera motion blur because the camera is being fed by that ABC file. Now if I connect either of these cameras here to that OctaneRender node, that will break that link and you'll lose that camera animation. It's also worth noting that when this file here is open, Octane standalone has write access to that ABC file, so you cannot then rerun. If we try and re-export that camera track, because that ABC file is already open in Octane standalone, you need to just either close that or write to a different file here. So that kind of covers how to get motion blur in Octane. A couple of other very quick things to watch out for. In the OctaneRender node here, it is always worth having pop-up render control window. If that is unticked, this window does not appear, and when that window is not on the screen, it's not obvious to you that Octane is rendering, and you might find that Nuke appears to be stalling. So make sure that you have that ticked, and make sure you have cache renders unticked. The only reason you would have cache renders if you want to actually cache a sequence into the timeline within Nuke. But if you're exporting animations, you definitely want cache renders unticked. So I hope that gives a good explanation of how all this works. If there's any questions, please let me know.